Only weeks ago, Tories were saying that Johnson would have to resign if he was found to have broken the law over Partygate. Now, he has been found to have broken the law. So what are they saying? Literally anything to keep him in office. Transport Minister Grant Shapps had the unenviable task of defending the indefensible on the morning news shows. Here he is talking to Kay Burley.
Who should be responsible for the goings-on in Downing Street when on at least 50 separate occasions the law was broken, if not the Prime Minister?
Well, even when the Prime Minister wasn't there, he's already said he takes full responsibility.
So 50 times the law was broken.
And this was, I was going to say, this is 2 years ago, this particular incident. And, since then, he's completely reformed. Number 10, been very large changes, as you know, in personnel. But look, I don't think there's any, I personally, when I heard about these goings on, was very upset. I didn't think I'd see my dad again. I think that a lot of people in the country will have felt the same way about it. It absolutely shouldn't happen. It's incredibly serious, and quite rightly, that's been recognised and fines been paid.
Who's responsible, Mr. Shapps? Who's responsible for at least 50 rule breaks, law breaks at Downing Street?
Well, obviously, individuals who
So not the Prime Minister. He doesn't have overall responsibility.
Of course he does.
Okay, so he's responsible for 50 times the law being broken in Downing Street, and yet he still remains in honour. Where's his honour?
Many of those times he won't have been there, but nonetheless, he says himself he takes overall responsibility, and I think that's absolutely the right thing for him to do.
75% of the public feel that he continually and deliberately lied. How can he remain in office as an honourable man? I'm guessing from what you're saying, you think he is an honourable man.
I do. I'm not saying that the Prime Minister isn't a flawed individual. We're all flawed in different ways. We all err. The question is, did somebody set out to do these things with malice? And actually, overall, is he doing a good job as Prime Minister? Which is why I do think it's relevant how he performs the rest of his job, the rest of his task.
So let's get this straight. Boris Johnson takes full responsibility for the criminal breaches at Downing Street. And his taking responsibility means removing people from office if they broke the law, but not removing himself, who broke the law and lied about it in Parliament. Still, though, he wants you to know that he takes personal responsibility for it. Note those words. When right-wingers tell the poor to take personal responsibility, they mean that people's taxes will rise and their benefits will fall, that the public services people rely on will be cut. For the poor, personal responsibility means no support and lots of punishment. For the ruling class, though, personal responsibility means saying sorry and then just moving on. Kay Burley's references to Johnson's honour are especially telling. We know that he's a professional liar and a serial cheat. We know that political expediency rather than principle drove him to campaign for Brexit. We know that he oversaw a government that handed out billions to Tory mates during the pandemic. And we know that at a time when just affording to live is a struggle for many, Boris Johnson did a dodgy deal to spend £800 per roll of wallpaper for his Downing Street flat. But Johnson has the right accent and wears the right suits, so he gets cast as a man of honour, civility, culture. These terms are really all about class. I'm not that interested in whether Johnson is a good person or not. We shouldn't turn questions of politics into questions of ethics. I care who he represents and in whose interests he governs. Many years ago, socialist councillors resisting cuts said better to break the law than break the poor. Johnson, of course, breaks both. So what matters about this story is what it reveals. Even the most basic elements of class society, law, the police, matter in upholding class rule and can sometimes be overlooked when it suits the wealthy. Here's Edwina Currie, former Tory minister.
You said that you're pretty sure that Boris Johnson, he did break the rules. He must have broken the rules. Do you mean the ministerial code rules about knowingly misleading Parliament? Do you believe that now we know what we know, he's been fined, he did break the law, that you do believe that, as you said quite casually in a way, that you think he did break the ministerial code, but actually that in itself shouldn't be enough to make him resign? Is that what you're saying? I just want to be clear.
Rhonda, I don't care I really don't care. What matters for me and what matters for millions of people in this country is the results we get from our politicians. The results we get from Boris are pretty good. I want to hold him to account for all sorts of things. We'll get to a general election in 2024. Well, let me just put it on the record. Last week, we had a by-election here in the High Peak, and we took a seat from Labour, which means we've taken control for the borough from Labour. And everybody had the opportunity to express their viewpoint. And what happened was we won the seat. We actually won it. That's what's happening up in the
I have to say, Edwina, I admire your frankness in saying that you don't care if it is the case that a serving Prime Minister knowingly misled Parliament. I mean, what does that say about where we are today in our political climate?
Well,
that a former MP can say quite calmly,
I don't mind a lawbreaker, and I don't care about a liar.
Not to be outdone, Michael Fabricant resorted to just making things up.
I don't think that at any time he thought that he was breaking the law. I think that at the time he thought, just like many teachers and nurses, who after a very, very long shift would tend to go back to the staff room and have a quiet drink, which is more or less what he has done.
You said all those teachers and nurses who were going back to the staff room and having a drink. You know more than I do, because I haven't heard about this.
Oh, well, I do know of some who did. And, it's quite natural. I'm not saying they were having a party. I'm not saying that Boris Johnson was having a party. But
the difficulty...
I know nurses
Mm.
who... and I don't think they were doing anything wrong.
Fine.
I mean, they'd work really hard on a long shift.
Isn't the
and would go back to the staff room and have a drink. And I think that is more or less what has happened on a few of these occasions.
When Etonians are under attack, turn the fire on nurses instead. Of course, nurses were not drinking in the staff rooms after fighting COVID on the wards, but still, it's a telling comparison. Johnson made the laws that banned those nurses from enjoying drinks together after saving lives. Then he broke those laws himself. Remember, between March 2020 and May 2021, over 1,500 frontline health workers lost their lives to COVID. The Royal College of Nursing issued this response. Most days, nurses and nursing support workers, when finally finishing a number of unpaid hours well past shift end, will get home, clean their uniforms, shower, and collapse into bed. Throughout the early pandemic, this was often alone for the protection of others, kept away from family, friends, and support networks. These shifts are long, unrelenting, understaffed, and intense. At the end of one of the many hours, days, and years we've worked since recognition of the pandemic, I can assure you that none of us have sought to hang out and have a quiet one in the staff room. There isn't a site in England that would allow alcohol on the premises for any professional to consume during working hours.
As someone who is the daughter of two frontline workers who were in their late 60s, who worked all throughout the pandemic, I can tell you there was no drinking, there was no socializing. It was actually an incredibly traumatic time that a lot of healthcare workers are going to have to spend a lot of time recovering from, and some may never recover from emotionally and psychologically. But I do think it is important to not just see these parties as individual failings of Boris Johnson. He is not the first. He won't be the last Prime Minister to be in total contempt of democracy and in contempt of the law. And we know that. How do we know that? We know that by the comfort that he and those around him felt when sending out those party invitations to hundreds of people. We knew that when we saw Allegra Stratton chortling with journalists about lockdown breaking cocktail parties. That sense of comfort comes from the fact that this kind of thing has happened again and again and again without consequences. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Watching those clips back to back, it's funny because there's a lot of marvel often towards Boris Johnson, particularly amongst very naive liberal journalists who treat him like he's this kind of smooth political operator who has climbed up the ranks through his own wiliness. He can't seem to be caught out. The exact opposite is actually true. He's actually very, very bad at lying, and he's actually very, very bad at covering up these kind of common, what is at this point quite pedestrian forms of corruption that underpin the British state. Other prime ministers, other politicians have generally been a bit better really at covering their tracks and keeping that stuff very much in the shadows. I think what Johnson does in a similar way to Trump is kind of make visible that fundamental contempt with which the political and financial elite hold us by being very bad at hiding that contempt. When you look at those ghastly interviews, like these aren't exactly like masterful media performances. They're rubbish. That appearance of being Teflon, that appearance of surviving despite doing things that should be unsurvivable politically, is because the Prime Minister and others like him are literally shielded by layers and layers and layers of institutional protection, whether it's the media choosing not to report on particular things or choosing not to make scandals out of things that are absolutely scandalous, or whether it's the Met Police, or whether it's any of these institutions. All of these institutions work to create that Teflon nature that Johnson's reputation seems to have, and that other conservative politicians, and indeed politicians in the British state in general, seem to have. It's that resilience is a product of power. It is not Johnson's individual character. And that's why when we critique these kind of scandals, it's important that we don't just focus our critique on him as a kind of exceptional liar or a man of exceptional moral bankruptcy, but rather on the system that not only produced him, but that continues to protect him. Because unless we focus our critique on that, we will never be able to rid ourselves of the Johnsons and the Sunaks, etc. So in that context, we have to ask ourselves, what does justice and accountability actually look like? Does it look like a fine? Does it look like this media circus apology tour? Does it look like a couple of bad headlines? Does it even look like Boris Johnson himself resigning? I would argue that none of those actually amount to justice and accountability, because the only pathway to justice and accountability is dismantling that system that creates the Johnsons and the Sunaks and the Blairs and the Thatchers, etc., etc. So I think it's really important to not get too tied up in the individual moral failings of Boris Johnson, even though there are many, but actually, what are those institutions that have been complicit in protecting him for all this time? It's those comedic politicians that we've just seen in those clips, but it's also institutions that actually have a huge amount of power to govern our everyday lives, of which I would include the press and also the Met Police, who, as we know, were absolutely complicit in the fact that Boris Johnson and his comrades felt so comfortable and felt so able to brazenly break these rules. And not only is the problem here the breaking of the rules, but actually putting people's lives in danger. Like at that point, socializing for, in this kind of context, in a party context, was literally an incredibly dangerous thing to do.